Okay, y'all. This is the last lecture. I know it's been a long week and the lectures have been dribbling out. But that's okay. This is the end. And I promise it's going to be short and it's going to be fun. But I really need to make sure that we connect everything that we've just learned back around to the beginning. So, first, before we jump into syncretism, we need to define its opposite, fundamentalism. So, in a non-religious sort of general way, fundamentalism is the strict adherence to the principles of any doctrine, subject, or discipline, right? Or a movement associated with strict adherence. Sometimes this has negative connotations, and I want to make sure that we're aware that that's not all the time. Sometimes this is just a descriptive term that helps us to understand a group's relationship to their doctrine. Right? So sometimes people think of it as inflexible or intolerant, but that is not what I am implying here by using the term fundamentalism to refer to certain faith practices. It's just the actual adherence part. So every Abrahamic monotheism has its own version of a kind of fundamentalism or strict adherence. In Judaism, it's Ultra-Orthodoxy. We've probably all heard the term fundamentalist Islam, although that's probably not quite, Islamic fundamentalism is probably not quite what you think of when you hear that term. I've included here some comics from Marjane Satrapi's comic, Persepolis, where she writes about her experience with the Islamic Revolution in Iran through the medium of comics, right? And so she talks specifically about fundamentalism in this case being not merely Islam and adherence to fundamental principles, but also a marriage of that religious practice with a system of governance, right? That is not always the case with fundamentalism. And so we want to be very, very careful not to overgeneralize. So really, though, this idea of fundamentalism and its practice as a return to some kind of original doctrine, the idea that that's what any faith group can do, actually starts in the 19th century. It's a very modern phenomenon, and it starts with Christianity. So Orthodox Judaism is not fundamentalism in this sense or ultra-Orthodox, I should say. But it does emerge, the versions that are ultra-Orthodox, they do emerge at the same time, as does a little bit after that, certain sects of fundamentalist Islam. But we're going to talk more about the changes in Islam next lecture. But I want to make it clear that Christianity is really where this idea begins, and it is a very modern idea. So actually the first definition you might have noticed, right, here, the definition I use that's more general is actually the second most common use of this term, because the first most common is actually regarding fundamentalist Christianity. So I'm going to read this definition and kind of talk about its relationship to history, right? Strict adherence to doctrines and practices held to be fundamental to Christianity, specifically the belief in the inerrancy of Scripture and literal acceptance of the creeds as fundamentals of Protestant Christianity. It also refers to the movement based on such beliefs within Protestant denominations. And it is in contrast with liberalism or modernism. So fundamentalism calls itself this because it considers itself as returning to some kind of original fundamental, right? Like I'm putting that in quotes because that's the word that is at the root of the descriptor. And the key thing here is that liberalism in all three faiths is associated with marrying traditions with modern life. And fundamentalism rejects a certain amount of that, where the modern life part is a problem. And so it attempts to hold that at a distance and hang on to traditions a little bit more maybe rigidly, right? But do note that the first recorded use that we have of this term, especially in this way, comes from the middle of the 19th century, right? This is a part of a major movement of 19th century revivalism, which is not the only revivalism that happens in Christianity. I mean, the Protestant Reformation is itself a form of fundamentalism, in a sense of attempting to discard the excesses of Catholicism and return to a more fundamental practice of Christianity. Right? So a particular version of this happens in the 19th century, and that's where we get a lot of the current contemporary Protestant sects, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and Latter-day Saints, or also known as Mormons. But each generation often has its own reformers or revivalists, right? And the Puritans are a really great example of this, because the Puritans... So you have Protestants, they're attempting to reform Catholicism. That's not the first time that's happened. Lateran IV, that was in 1215, where they're like, priests should maybe be celibate. Also, the Pope is in charge, and various rules and things for monastic folks, right? That version of medieval Christianity arrives on the scene really late, 1215, right? And then you have the Protestant Revolution, which we're going to have a chance to talk about a little bit late, not revolution, Reformation. And then after that, once England becomes Protestant, there's even a group of people within those Protestants who are like, we are not Protestant enough. And those folks call themselves Puritans, right? And Puritans tend to be a foundational cultural pillar of American society because of the Mayflower in Massachusetts. But they started from a place of just rejecting worldly entertainment, right? So this is a great comic of a Puritan preacher railing against Shakespeare, the wickedness of Shakespeare. But then we come along in the 19th century, and that happens kind of all over again, in particular in America. So the key thing is that fundamentalism doesn't stop happening. It just takes on a new face for each generation that engages in it, right? So the key thing that differentiates fundamentalism from other forms of a religion, including fundamentalist Christianity or fundamentalist Judaism or fundamentalist Islam. Fundamentalism says there is only one way. There is only one God. There's only one right way to understand the scripture and the doctrine that supports this belief system. And there's only one right way to behave. And everyone else is wrong. And the consequences of wrongness are usually eternal damnation. So, sorry, I probably shouldn't make light of that. That's the core of any group that calls itself fundamentalist, or not even that calls itself, but that deserves the label of fundamentalist, is that our way is the only way, and everyone else is wrong. Syncretism, which is really the thing we're trying to understand here, is essentially the exact opposite of fundamentalism. So I define fundamentalism first so that we can understand syncretism maybe more fully as the capaciousness of any one religious system, because you'll see that either or is possible in all of these faiths. Like we've talked about how the Abrahamic faiths are supersessionists, right? They consider themselves to be superseding the one that came before. But that supersessionist impulse And that fundamentalist idea does not always dominate the actual practice of the religion, right? And that's where we start to see some really interesting syncretism, where the practices as a religion spreads out across the world, they diversify and they become regionally specific. So syncretism is the combining of these different belief systems when two different systems encounter one another, and then they blend together, right? They don't compete, they integrate. And one of the principles that makes syncretism possible is when people on both sides of those systems understand that there's some kind of unity between those different systems. So when they see, oh, your idea of this actually lines up with my idea of this, and they're not that different, and then those two things can integrate, right? There we go, and become their own practice. And finally, the fundamental feature of syncretism is that it is essentially inclusive of other faiths and practices. It can never say our way is the only way, because it is always incorporating and including other practices, which implies a certain amount of respect at the bottom, right? You don't incorporate a practice into your own tradition if you think that it's not real or valid, right? Instead, you find something valuable in it, and then you find a way to relate to it and incorporate it. So syncretism is totally the opposite of fundamentalism. So, and yes, even monotheistic faiths can be syncretic. So this is the fun world tour. When different cultures with their different belief systems get together, a few things can happen, and which one really depends a lot on how fundamentalist the adherents are on either side, right? They can live alongside one another independently. This is not always a peaceful thing. Think about Jews in medieval Europe, where they're kind of allowed to live and let live for a while, and then religious-based bigotry and hatred rises up again, and then they get expelled. So it can happen. This is not the most common form, but one of the big things that leads to this is a power differential. So both sides are fairly fundamentalist, but one side is significantly more powerful than the other. So it's not a contest of wills. It's just a question of whether or not the powerful side chooses to exercise that power. Then there's also conversion is a possibility, whether that's forced or not. The two faiths can come into contact and be roughly equally, if they're equally fundamentalist, this often doesn't lead to conversion, voluntary conversion, let's put it that way. But it can lead to conflict wherein forced conversion is on the table. And there can then also be a mixing of traditions. Sometimes this is with the goal of conversion through finding similarities. But that doesn't always end up working out in the favor of the people trying to do the converting. Let's talk about some examples. And this is really it. We're going to look at some examples of how syncretism operates in Christianity. And we're done. We're done. Well done. Christmas. Literally all of Christmas is a syncretic blend. Like all of it. It's based on the pagan ritual of Yule, which is celebrated at the winter solstice. And it is the longest night of the year. And what the Northern European pagans would celebrate is the return of the light, because after Yule, the days start getting longer. And that is an enormous relief when you live in higher latitudes and the nights are very long. So the celebration of this return of the light lined up for Christian missionaries with the birth of Christ. And they're like, let's just combine these two things and we will celebrate the birth of the light of the world at this time of year when you celebrate light. And voila, we now have Christmas. Jesus was probably actually born in the summer. So this is not at all about the literal birth time of Jesus. It is about co-opting a pagan ritual that they would never have gotten the pagans to give up. And instead, they paste a Christian practice over the top of the pagan ritual, and voila, we have Chritmas. We don't even have Christmas. Typo. That's fine. This is why we have the veneration of evergreens as a part of Christmas. That's a part of the pagan ritual, particularly plants that can survive the winter. That's a part of why these become central to our decor in the Christmas season, is because they're central to the celebration of Yule and the persistence of life even in the middle of winter. Also, Saint Nicholas, who later becomes Santa Claus. The way that legend evolves is actually really fascinating, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, I promise. And in parts of Germanic portions of Europe, there's his sidekick Krampus, which is, totally Christian. That guy looks like he belongs, in the Americas. Voudou is an Afro-Caribbean syncretism, and this one is particular to Haiti and New Orleans, and it's not that different from Santeria, which is also an Afro-Caribbean syncretism. In both cases, with slight differences, you have the adoption of an African pantheon, and you have the alignment of those African gods with Catholic saints, and then a combination of rituals that incorporate Catholic and African spiritualities, right? And then there's Central America, which honestly gives you some of the best syncretism in the world, if you ask me, because Central American Catholicism is highly inflected with indigenous beliefs and practices. What you see here is actually an example of, on the left, you have a Mayan temple. It's called the Mayan Temple of the Foliated Cross, just because that's what it looks like. But this is the Mayan world tree, which explains the entire Mayan understanding of the universe, with the lower realms, and then the middle realm where the people live, and the upper realm of the spiritual, right? And this is a drawing of the side of a temple. And this is an amazing Catholic church not too far away. And what's interesting is they take the imagery of the world tree and the foliated cross, and they kind of stamp it onto the cross of Christianity, and the two systems start to signify together. Some of the places we see this are in Mayan shrines and rituals. So this is actually a Catholic saint who is dressed up as in traditional Mayan garb. This is some Santeria happening at a Mayan shrine. And on the far right is a Mayan shrine, complete with the Virgin of Guadalupe and Mayan ritual stonework, right? And a Mayan altar. So this kind of overlapping of practices gives different regions of the world the specific flavor of their belief system. So yes, you can say that these folks are Catholic, sort of, but that their belief system is definitely influenced by the indigenous practices that predate the addition of Catholicism to this area. Another great version of this. So there's a nice painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which by itself is a really interesting syncretic image, because it is essentially the depiction of the Virgin Mary as an indigenous woman. Like the imagery around her, including the tongues of radiance, right? Including her outfit, which is more often green as opposed to blue. Blue is how it is in traditional iconography, but note the blue is on the inside of her robe here, and the green is on the outside. That is particular to this depiction. She also is pictured with darker skin, and depending on the version, she'll often have indigenous prints in her garb. So this is an indigenous Virgin Mary. And we see her right here on the garb of one of the flyers who's participating in this dance. And this literally is a Mayan indigenous practice celebrating the legend of the creation of the world by bird spirits. So this is a flute player who sits on top of this tree, which symbolizes the Mayan world tree. And these four flyers, they dance their way down this pole in a really intricate acrobatic dance to replay or reenact the Mayan creation myth, right? And here he is with his Virgin of Guadalupe on his sash in front of his Catholic church. This is like the definition of syncretism. And my favorite version of syncretism comes from Dia de los Muertos, right? The celebration of not just the Day of the Dead, but this entire spirituality that believes in the recontact with the dead through Dia de los Muertos. That all predates Christianity in this region. And its celebration is inflected with indigenous imagery and iconography. And yes, you do have these nods to Catholicism. You get your cross on the altar. This actually is the bottom of a cross as well in the parade. You have the crosses in the cemetery, which makes sense. It's a Catholic cemetery. But literally everything else about the celebration of this very important ritual in Mexico, everything else about it is indigenous. And I wanted to end our survey of Christian syncretism with a current ritual that happens in the Philippines. And I think this is just kind of fun and interesting because of the way it circles back around. This is the Black Nazarene. And he is taken out of the main Catholic church in Manila in the Philippines and paraded through the city, and he is said to heal people. So folks, like millions of people, descend upon the path that he's going to take through the city, and they try to get close enough to touch the cross or the icon, specifically because they believe in its healing power. And the reason I say that this brings us full circle is because the Philippines came into contact with Catholicism through Spanish colonization, and what ended up happening is Mexican missionaries went from Mexico to the Philippines with this image of the Nazarene, right? The Jesus carrying the burden of the cross. And the cross itself was like shipwrecked, and the ship burned down, and the cross survived. And then it's also survived a couple of other fires and earthquakes, which is what makes the people here believe in its miraculous power. It also might be why it's black. Unclear, but I did see that was part of the speculation. So this is a multiply syncretic practice because this very item comes from an already syncretic system in Mexico and then travels to the Philippines and then starts to participate in the Filipino belief systems. And so you have three layers of European, really specifically Spanish Catholicism, plus Mexican Catholicism, now Filipino Catholicism. Right? So there is this capacity for any religion. I think I want to be very clear that this is not about the difference between a monotheism and a polytheism, or between one of the Abrahamic faiths and another. It's that every religion has the capacity to become either very fundamentalist and attempt to attempt to regulate what counts, what's real, or it can be syncretic.